Hello, Grandpa Bob.
Hi, Sammy.
And we're back here for part two.
All right.
So, part two of 20 Heroes. So, when we last met on spring break, we talked about George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt. And it just happens to be a coincidence, but the next person you wanted to talk about was Harry S. Truman, and today is it May 26th, 2016? So,
yes.
Yeah, so President Obama was just in Japan for the 71st anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, and this seems like quite a coincidence to then get to talk about Harry S. Truman. Why was he one of your heroes, historical heroes?
Well, he was, even though I grew up in Missouri, of course I was young at the time and and didn't really know that much about him as a person, but in fact very little, but until he became president. Of course, Missourians then were proud that their state was represented in Washington then. But he was thrust into a situation there following a near icon, FDR, and had never been brought into the loop on the Manhattan Project or the Hanford Washington project. And I think one of the atomic weapons was fission, and one was fusion, whatever that means. That's not my field, but anyway, and then here he had the war on his hands and total responsibility for for trying to end that war, and made well, he was kind of a horse sense sort of a person.
What does horse sense mean?
Well,
like that phrase.
Well, you just look at what's there, and you make a decision that's you might say practical. You don't bring in too much theory on or hypothesis or thesis on either side. You say, well, this is a job got to be done. Let's do it. And so if the tree's in the way of the road, you cut it down, and you don't. That's sort of the.
That's horse sense.
That's sort of.
Well, you had mentioned that Missourians were so proud to have, a president from their state. When you were little, or I guess, how old would you have been in 1945?
Well, just to give you a perspective, I was helping my grandparents plant 4,000 celery slips or plants, and we got word that someone stopped and said that President Roosevelt had died, and then that was in the spring, and then a little later in the summer, on my 10th birthday, 1945, why the first atomic test bomb was set off in White Sands, New Mexico, at the Alamogordo test facility there.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was subsequent to that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and then 3 days later, Nagasaki.
So you're about 10 years old
10 years
when Harry S. Truman became president. Do you remember any kind of, when I think about if I went to a gift shop or a novelty shop or a record store, during the Bush years, you could often find bumper stickers and T-shirts. Were there? Do you remember any kind of promotional items or souvenirs, things that you could buy in Missouri to celebrate Truman becoming president?
Well, I don't remember that, but then when the reelection campaign came up, when his reelection came up, um, my mother was a retail florist, and she made a big wreath in the shape of Lincoln County, Missouri, and the caption on it was Lincoln County sings with Truman, and so they were. It was, of course, the county Democrats were supporting Harry S. Truman then, and in the let's see, that would have been in about 47, fall of 40, ready for whatever the I guess because he would have taken off. No, been 48. I guess he would have taken office in 49 of January of 49. I believe the inaugural was still at January 20th or whatever the date, unless it was changed after that.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so what besides his horse sense and being from Missouri, what are some other things that you find heroic or admirable about Truman?
Well, he had convictions, and he didn't he would make a decision and he would stick with it, and he seemed like, and he was very loyal to his friends, and he had been a junior officer over in I'm not sure if he was a captain or a major over in the First World War overseas. And in fact, my great uncle Joe Beebe was a junior officer in his group and soldiered with him, and they saw action there in World War One. And then later on, as they said, Harry took care of his buddies. He got Uncle Joe a job as a I'm not sure, with a facilitator or whatever it was called. Kind of like he went around to different bases. They were like Fort Leonard Wood and sort of as an inspector, maybe like an auditor. Got him a job as, we'll call it, an auditor. But Harry, of course, had a sign in his office, "The buck stops here," and he was always kind of considered a lightweight and a.
I realize some people might think that the buck stops here. They might think of like a dollar bill, but is the idea it's a buck like a deer that you're hunting, and that, or what? I'm just curious about the origin of that phrase, or was it Truman that popularized it?
Well, Truman popularized it, but in other words, this is as far up the decision-making chain as it goes. It's not going any further. This is it. And in other words, he was the ultimate. He made the decision, and he was going to stick with it and live with it, and let the chips fall where they may, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so that was sort of his demeanor. He was famous for his what they call the morning constitutionals. He got up and took a walk every morning, and reporters, and even though he was kind of a short, stubby guy in a way, he was a brisk walker, and all the reporters would tag along and have to chase him, to talk to him as they walked, and so that was sort of his daily press conference, and then he took real issue on anybody that picked on his friends, or and especially his daughter Margaret, and so.
Why did people pick on Margaret?
Well, Margaret was played the piano and probably let's say she probably played the piano well, but not as a virtuoso. And the critics sort of lampooned her, and Harry took real offense at that, and because they were picking on his only child, his daughter, and so there was a big brouhaha over that at one point. I don't know who the critic was that he really got after, and I guess he could probably throw out a few, fancy words too, but of course so could Eisenhower, and I guess none of them were as coarse probably as Nixon, but in that count. So, but he's the one that made the decision over the atomic bomb, and as he said, he went to bed and slept like a log. He didn't have any compunction about it. The military assessment or the intelligence assessment was that it was going to take 500,000 people. We'd lose 500,000 people taking Japan by invading it on the ground. Now, even though we had sunk all their shipping and there wasn't many ships that they could get out to float, but they still had lots of soldiers, and the mindset of the Japanese people was they would fight to the last drop of blood, and so you'd had to personally kill every one of them to change their mindset. Well, the atomic bomb changed the mindset, and so that was enough to and their leader, Emperor Hirohito, was considered a god on Earth, and so that even got him involved, and then of course he put the heat on the Tojo and the different military leaders to bring it to a conclusion.
Yeah, I'd never heard that about the idea of the emperor being like a god on Earth, and I imagine it would be kind of world-shattering, literally, but also figuratively for people that once humans had kind of played God with the matter of the universe and the atoms, that the atomic bomb seems like the power of God.
Well, it was kind of the Japanese. They were probably more emphatic about that than either ISIS or the Taliban. So, and they're warped in the Wahhabis. All that religious idealism that those people possess. So. Anyway, it took that to change the whole perspective and say, look, we've got to save our people, because we're beat. We have to throw in the towel. And later on, I roomed with a man who had been a young soldier, and his job was to ferry Japanese prisoners back from Manchuria, and Japan had a lot of troops over on Manchuria. And
why would they take them to Manchuria?
Well, they conquered that area. They were conquering China and Manchuria, and that was part. And of course, that's why we had to fight them all the way across the Pacific, all those islands, and all the Marianas and Saipan and Tinian and Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal and all of those. So they were all out through and you had to fight them all the way back to Tokyo. And in fact, there were still Japanese living in caves on some of those islands 20 years after the war, and they still thought they were still holding out because they still believed in the emperor was God, and so, which is, we think looks irrational to us here.
Well, belief,
And then Truman, he had economic. He did some things for economics, and of course he had a real battle royal with the Congress, not unlike what Obama's had, and there was. But he did several things. He did try to rebuild our steel mills and get our up to date, which I guess was a stopgap, but and help our industry. Of course, at the end of World War II, we were dominant because ours survived and the others were destroyed. And but I know in 1950 he put up the money made available the money to revamp the steel mills there in Pittsburgh. And and the people in Pittsburgh, they thought Truman was great because he was helped create a lot of jobs. And they thought he was good for the economy. And then that's when he ran against he ran against Dewey in 49? I'm losing my dates there, but they thought he was. That's when the headlines said Dewey wins, and
yeah,
and so Truman, of course, held up that paper. But he was just he was a very practical. I think he was a very practical, pragmatic politician, and I'm sure he had to make a lot of deals, like they all do. But the common man felt like they had their man in the White House.
well, that's good.
And then, of course, there was the thing about MacArthur and over in Korea and over the 38th parallel, and of course MacArthur wanted to go in and bomb into China, and Truman, I don't know. I guess the history will play it out, but it seemed like history said that he was right in holding the line at the 38th parallel, even though North Korea is a mess today. But we couldn't have gone and completely taken over North Korea without having to fight all of China at that time, and so that because that was China's doorstep, and then MacArthur was fighting him, and so he fired MacArthur, and of course that's back when General Curtis LeMay was head of the SAC, and he wanted to bomb them into the Stone Age. Well, you start slinging nuclear weapons all over North Korea and just China, well then that would have unleashed another. Who knows what would have happened then? So
Yeah.
So 38th parallel. That's where Truman wanted to hold it, and that's where they held it. So, and we still got 30,000 troops sitting there backing that up today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, Harry S. Truman sounds like a heck of a guy. The next person on your list is Benjamin Franklin. And, I think, we could probably make a multi-hour, or a 2 to 3 hour thing about one of our founding fathers. What about Ben Franklin makes him one of your heroes?
Well, I think he was a multifaceted personality, and he was an inventor. He was a printer. um, and quite a statesman, and I think he was a great negotiator, um, and I think he had one of the first, was involved in one of the first fire insurance companies in Philadelphia, and back then every owner of a home, you took out a membership in a certain fire department, and you put a fire brand on the side of your house. So if your brand was a pumper station A and your neighbor's was pumper station B, why they would never the twain would meet. So if you had a fire, you had to have your own pumper station coming. And of course, those were the little hand carts then, and where the guys were two guys pumping on a handle with a tank of water, and I guess it would be, of course, naturally horse drawn. But I think his negotiations and with foreign countries played a big role in a fledgling country like the United States, and they needed somebody with a perspective that he was not unlike Jefferson, or for that matter Hamilton. And I think when you look at the whole beginning first fathers of the country, why we were really blessed by having some of the best minds probably in the world, and in putting something together, and because it's held and it's I think it's admired all over the world, even though not followed. So we continue to be an attraction for oppressed people because they like our style of government, and Franklin was certainly part of that.
Yeah, it remains to be seen, based on how things are going right now, how, I'm optimistic that we'll find a way to unite, but man, sometimes I wonder what these historical figures would think if they could see today what America looks like. Would they be proud of certain freedoms that are extended? What would shock them? What would make sense to them, that if they knew the history, that they would be able to say, well, it makes perfect sense that our, because sometimes I think about policy and government, the way maybe software developers think of software. Our computers would not be effective if we had to use the same operating system that MS-DOS used, or IBM did back in the 60s. They had to continually refine and try new things and see what worked, and it evolved, and it just keeps evolving.
Well, your best example, of course, is like right now is your Supreme Court, and there's the people that think of keep talking about the Constitution this, Constitution that. Well, but the very people that say we've got to adhere to the intent of the Constitution are also they're the biggest proponents of the NRA. And I believe in the Second Amendment. I think everyone should have a muzzle loader and a powder horn. And,
do you have one?
No, but anyway, according to the Second Amendment, that was the technology of the time, and so that's what you would have had.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't believe in things evolving, then you couldn't have an AK-47. So the very people that says, well, we can't play fast and loose with the Constitution, the NRA is the worst offender.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if you're using that analogy, well, it blows my mind, and but there's things that occur today that we couldn't. There's no way we could have envisioned any of this.
Yes.
And so you have to look at it in context with the times, and so yeah, it's but we kind of if but there are some basics, and there's the freedom of freedom of expression, and but you can even hedge that a little bit. In other words, does a whistleblower have a right? Is that free speech, or is that
Betraying the company.
betrayal? Yeah, betrayal. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, it's,
a guy like Snowden, for example. How do you? In other words, he supposedly was in an area, in a job where he had trust. He was trusted with information, and so on the one hand, we're probably as a society better off with it out there on the one hand. On the other hand, why he betrayed his trust. So.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm noticing it's a generational divide frequently when it comes to Snowden. He confirmed what people had often suspected, which was the government surveillance and
the Orwell thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't know enough particulars about what information he leaked. But yeah, it's a tricky situation. I hope that someday he can be pardoned, because I think even though he had that trust, he knew that the people who had trusted him were doing fundamentally un-American things, and that his conscience spoke up, and that he wanted American people to know what was happening. So I think people, I don't know, need to understand that the greater value of his.
But he had been given a good job to have access to that privileged information.
Well, I bet Hitler gave good jobs to people too. I mean, maybe it would be really nice if one of the person that Hitler trusted with, like, the shipping lists to Auschwitz had used his conscience. I mean,
yeah.
I know that's a bit of an exaggeration, but as far as the analogy goes, if you trust someone with information, you need to make sure that you are a person whose trust is worth keeping, I guess. It is my way of thinking, that I think Snowden is a good man and has his heart in the right place and has American values. And then he saw his government behaving in a very undemocratic way, in a very un-American way, and decided to take a stand. So, we'll see. But getting back to Benjamin Franklin, one thing I often associate with him is wisdom, his sayings, from like the diary. I think he has a diary or some kind of book which
his almanacs.
Yeah, and
almanacs.
There are so many sayings that have filtered through the American consciousness that when people are asked, God helps those who help themselves. Now, Ben Franklin said that, but there are some Christians in this country who think that that's a verse from the Bible. God helps those who help themselves. you know, and so many of our values that, like, maybe the Protestant work ethic and things like that. Because as I look at your notes on your heroes, one value you have a lot, and this will come up when we get to Barack Obama, is the value of education and hard work. So I think a lot of that goes back to Ben Franklin, who, and the colonialists, because I read, I was in a class where we learned about, is during the age of exploration. We read journals and letters and plays and novels, or what passed for novels, during the time that ships were going all over the world. And so many people got kind of suckered or hoodwinked into believing that there were no opportunities in England, and there weren't, that they came to the New World, and then they got very depressed when they got here because there were none of the conveniences.
None of the amenities.
Yeah. There's no playhouse, there were no bars. The houses were cold, and no roads, no running water. Like, basically.
Well, the Pilgrims there at Plymouth Plantation, they lost a lot of people, just illness and deprivation and lack of food and the whole 9 yards. It was a tough go, and
well, so perhaps, like, the people who survived and all the sacrifice and the hard work that made this nation what it is, even though I don't want to get into the issue of the genocide of the Native Americans or the theft of land. That we can maybe talk about that later. But this idea of hard work, like, living is really hard work, and to have the life you want, it takes a lot of hard work. And I think that that's a value that maybe stems from how hard it was for our ancestors to make a life here in this country.
Well, even if you go back to my grandfather, my grandparents, say my granddad Watts, he barely ever saw hard money till he was a grown man, and everything they did in that family was to set the table. Just you grew it, you raised it, you hunted it, you fished for it, and you were constantly working just to get the next meal on the table, and strictly to survive. And then ever so often you'd have a DPT thing come through, and you'd wipe out all the kids in the between ages of this and that. And there was one cemetery over there by Winfield that was just full of little kids, and they just wiped out the whole, several years of children, like the plague in Europe, and so, and it was before, let's say, any valid science. When you get right down to it, the public health is only a fairly recent thing, and the guy that was the hero of public health is the guy that supposedly took the handle off of the town pump.
Yeah.
Because, they didn't suspect it was the water, that was polluted, and so everybody was being so. Anyway, and then I quite remember. I remember the Iceman. I remember all the basics. It was not unusual to see a guy coming into town with 2 horses and a wagon, and maybe if one of the pulling horses was a mare. Her colt would be tagged on behind, trotting along on a halter and behind the wagon. So, and
why are you talking about the Iceman and the horses?
well, I'm just saying how things have evolved, and back, and we talk about these pilgrims, and how brutal things were, and how just survive,
Well, in the show Mad Men, there's in one of the later seasons, they're at a funeral for an old woman who was born in a barn and died on like the 50th floor of a Manhattan apartment building. And Bert Cooper, the boss who's giving the eulogy, says, she wasn't just a woman who we all loved, she was an astronaut. That the idea that you could be born in a barn in Ohio and that American capitalism and society enabled her to attain enough wealth to be 50 stories up in the sky. That's a bit like going to the stars. I mean,
yeah.
And maybe it's that potential that, and I don't know if that kind of rise, but people pin their hopes on that. And maybe I'm way too saturated in the mythology and the what's in the water of the American river, that I've been drinking from, the well I've been drinking from. But it definitely seems, based on the number of people from all around the world who do want to come here, that dream is still alive and well and potent, even if the realities are that the system might seem really rigged against that kind of advancement today. But I think also about my brother, who is a great success. I love visiting him and seeing his house and hearing about his travels.
Mm-hmm.
But in some little part of my brain, I always remember living on Fifth Avenue in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, in the backyard, where he would dig a hole in the yard, get the hose, fill it with mud or water, and then sit in the mud and have a mud bath and eat dog food.
Yeah.
Little kids are funny, It's like, but that we grew up there, and now he's on his way back from Taiwan today, for all I know, it's amazing that through his hard work and his education as an attorney, that is possible, because there are so many places in the world where that wouldn't be possible.
Yeah. Well, see, as far as he could still be skateboarding all over Scotts Bluff. That was my, well, anyway.
Is that your memory of youthful Mark? Is his skateboard and rollerblade days?
Well, he was fun-loving kid. He was in some ways he wasn't all that serious, but yet he was he had curiosity. But then I know we were out there trying to clean out behind that old barn when we lived out on the acreage out there, and it was kind of hot, and we were pulling weeds and the like, and about every 10 minutes he'd have to go in and get a drink of water or something. He didn't care much for that being hot and sweaty at the time.
Neither did I. I hated outdoor work.
Then he turned around, spent all that time playing basketball, and there you have to put in a lot of, and you did too. You had to play, put in a lot of hard work on that.
Well,
Anyway,
it's hard to impress girls pulling weeds.
What I think is about you kids, you and your siblings. You're you were born with a good mind and basically healthy bodies, and I know you had a little more trouble with your ears, and the other kids got along pretty good. But your parents, I remember your dad saying to me, he was a second-year law student, and he was sort of and had two boys at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't think he had accomplished anything in life. And I said, hey, here you're 30 years old or 31 or something like that, whatever he was. Why? I said, man, you're already. I mean, you got a college degree behind you, and then you're already halfway through law school. I said, what percentage of people at the age of 30 or whatever your age is ever achieved that much? And you've got a nice family. I think he was just working so hard. He was, we all take stock and say, well, is this all there is, or as far as I? And but the other thing is, your dad and your mother both had enough maturity and exposure and were enough into education, and they put a lot of money into you kids, and I can remember them buying Mark a digital camera. Those things were pricey,
expensive.
close to $500.
Yeah.
But it was, in other words, you think today you go buy the better camera for $100. But anyway, it was a new technology. But anyway, you had computers. You're sitting there at 6, 7 years old. You're playing with computers. Katie's school at Hague had one computer for every 2 kids or 4, whatever it was.
Yeah.
But they, and you kids could avail yourself of the latest in technologies that many kids would only dream of. Plus, you traveled, and you had parents who had traveled, and you had parents that, read to you and nurtured all these things, and you didn't have to work like dogs just to grub out a living.
It's true.
And so, I mean, so.
Not until I worked at the Olive Garden, then I had to work like a dog.
Well,
as a server there.
Well, but think of the. How about they can write a book on that? So you can write a story on detasseling corn and
I've had my students are always when they find out about all the different jobs I've had, they just and I think that it all brought me to where I am.
You're running drugs all over Scotts Bluff.
No, I never had one of those. I never had. Oh, okay. You're talking about when I worked at the pharmacy.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought you were making a joke saying.
No.
I've never.
It's how you label things.
Grandpa Bob, for the record, since this is going online, I have never sold drugs illicitly, illegally. They were always prescription drugs through USAVE Pharmacy in Scottsbluff, Nebraska.
I know that. It's just a way of phrasing things. Anyway, we laughed about it. But I'm just saying that your parents realized the value of education, and they made the technologies that they knew and available to you. And
and when in the field of teaching, sometimes we're asked to self-reflect and consider how we've gotten to where we are, and why we were successful. Um, because if a teacher is able to become educated and apply for a job and they get a classroom, they are a success at that certain point. Now, then it gets much much more difficult as you have to learn
Yeah.
how to bring the knowledge and information to the students, and then that's where a lot of doubt can creep in, is like wondering, are you doing a good enough job? But with that self-reflection, when I've been interviewed or asked about this, I've had to say, well, I think there are three things that really, really made a difference. Number one, where it all goes to, is my parents for creating a stable, loving home where they read to us, they had high expectations, they enrolled us in everything. Piano lessons, gymnastics, flag football, Cub Scouts, to create well-rounded individuals. The second thing is my dad's success as an attorney enabled him to provide more than enough for his family, to where I got a computer in second grade, which started a love of learning and manipulation of devices, and um, being able to write novels and paint things on the computer screen, and read off of CD-ROM encyclopedias. And then the third thing was the education system in Scottsbluff. And this goes with that stable household, but all of my teachers every year at Longfellow Elementary, there's so much consistency that, I don't know. When I think about those three things, you add that up together, and I think it would be hard not to have three kids that are doing all right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one reason I'm glad the Foss kids got to go to Carlisle, to be at this really good school system in a mid-sized town
All the way through.
Yeah, there's a stability that comes from that, and because all the data that shows kids who move around a lot, um, like if they're uprooted and move around a lot, they can really struggle later on in life, finding one place to stop and say, this is where I want to be.
Well, they lose the continuity of different disciplines within that, and well, I was in what, two schools in first grade, and I was in two schools in the second grade, and let's see, third grade I was in one school, fourth grade through eighth in a different school. So
do you feel like that moving around a lot had an appreciable effect on you?
well, I don't know. I learned things from each of those experiences, though, that would, maybe made me more cosmopolitan, or and I saw different communities. And
Cosmopolitan is the first adjective that always comes to mind when I think of you, Grandpa Bob.
so I don't, I'm just, well, I started in Iberia, Missouri,
Yeah.
but I don't think I'd been in school a month, and then I had my appendix out,
Oh.
and then you have at least 3 weeks convalescence at home, and you're all wrapped up. There's no penicillin then either, and so because when I got back to school, they wouldn't let me go down the stairs, and because you didn't want to tear that incision, or you didn't want to get peritonitis. If you, it's like Civil War. If you were gut shot, you're dead. There's no way to save you. And then in Wentzville, I was at parochial school, and that's where I walked across Highway 40 and two sets of railroad tracks and on down. And I don't know if I ever made any. I don't think I ever made any friends there. I mean, and I can't remember,
Yeah.
And I had made some there in Iberia because I was there in the summer, and I got acquainted with. There was these twin girls that I'd leave early so that I didn't have to walk with them. Because they were always wanting to hold each one held an arm.
Wow! I can picture a young Bobby Watts.
Well, I was
one twin on each arm.
Get away from them, and
yeah. Why were they just annoying, or were you not interested in girls, or
I don't know.
Were they dog faced?
No, there was nothing wrong with. I think they were even what do you call them, maternal twins instead of, or they were. I don't think they were identical, but they were. They biologically they were.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I don't remember that much about Winsville, other than that